you can see my DP. I look like that on the internet. I am Sanket. Great. So yeah, that's me. Different when you go to conferences around the world, and when you come to India, the Indian food and lunch, and that's the USP, which is really nice. But yeah, you might know me from this project called Native Base, which is a UI component library for React Native, and also works on the web. I run this company called Geeky Ants, and these days I'm building GlueStack, which is a framework, a full stack framework that lets you build web, mobile, and also APIs. And this is the caravan that they were talking about. So this was the viral tweet. So I think people ask me always like, what was your inspiration? Like, how did you come up with the idea? And I think it goes back to the movie Swades by SRK, where he drives his caravan around Delhi and go to the villages and also works there. So that was a dream. But yeah, I'm not going to talk about that. My topic is building a universal CSS-in-JS library. CSS-in-JS, are you serious? People, I can see people laughing and frowning with the word CSS-in-JS. It's such a controversial topic, but recently I've seen this gain popularity again, once again. And that's what we are going to talk about. We are going to talk about styling. Remember this movie? Anyway, what are universal libraries? I asked this question on Twitter. What do you call an app that runs on iOS, that runs on Android, and also on web? The most of the answers that I got was for cross-platform. People voted for cross-platform. And the second was universal. My friend Evan, who works at Expo, he had a very nice reply to my poll, which says, universal is something that is interoperable between web and native, while cross-platform is something that is only on mobile phones, not on web. So that's why I'm going to use the word universal for the CSS-in-JS library that we are going to build. And hybrid is obviously Ionic, Cordova, and things like that. This is a bit different than React philosophy. This is more of a Java philosophy. It was made famous in early 90s. I'm pretty sure most of you were not born back then, but yeah. Write once, run anywhere. This is the idea that I'm behind. And most of my work revolves around this idea. Write once and run anywhere. Obviously, not this run. Great. So who is writing universal apps? Yeah, Nitin, I can see your hand. So Razorpay is writing. I missed the logo. But there are a bunch of other companies too, other than Razorpay, who is doing universal. Obviously, React Native comes from Meta, and all the people, many projects at Meta does use React Native and React Native Web to share code between web and mobile. Twitter mobile web app is built using React Native Web, so they do share some bits here and there. Yesterday, Varsha spoke about React Native Web 2, and I can see a lot of work being shared between web and mobile in the Flipkart app and Flipkart Web app too. Not just that, but the recently announced Blue Sky app was also built using Expo. This was done by one developer. You can understand the amount of benefit that you get when one developer can build an entire app like Twitter. And that's using Expo, that is ultimately using React Native and Web. Great. So what exactly is React Native Web? I guess most of you know it. It's a drop-in replacement of React Native APIs on the web. So essentially, you build your entire React Native app, and after that, you can bring in the same code, alias the React Native package with React Native Web, and it just works. So if you're not using any native APIs, this would essentially work like a charm. Okay? Great. I've got some reasons why you should not use one code base for all. The first one is, if you're getting paid by hours, go ahead and rebuild the same app twice, and you'll be paid more. Second one is, if you love two different technologies, like developers, right? We care about technologies. Who cares about the users? So if you want to learn that, or maybe you want to develop slower, go ahead and build two different apps. OK, jokes apart, I can see Kamlesh frowning there a bit. But yeah, so while your friends and other friends can say, okay, I've got Next.js, I've got Swift UI, I've got React Native, and all those things, and then you can say, मेरे पास single code base है, right? But yeah, there, you want to take this picture? Go ahead. But there were some genuine reasons not to use React Native on the web, right? And I say there were, they do exist, but essentially, if you look at the article by Airbnb that was written 7 years ago, it's no more true. In fact, the title of that article is very different than the content. Like it says why they moved away from React Native. Essentially, they appreciated all those things about React Native and also React Native Web somewhere. So there were some reasons 5 years back, 7 years back. I've categorized all these in dated perspectives. These are dated. These are somewhat true, not very true. The first dated perspective is React Native on web is slow. I think all those companies that are using React Native Web, they are saying it's not slow. And I ran a random test, Lighthouse code test, on one of the pages that we built, the landing page of gluestack.io, and it was very random. I ran it, and the Lighthouse score was 100. It was not even 99, it was 100. So we can safely say that React Native on web is not slow. You're writing not so good code, that's the problem. But yeah, I rate this as 0 out of 5, so it's not that slow. Though there are other metrics that you may care about, but essentially React Native Web altogether, if you have proper SSR implemented, you are using the flush function, it works pretty well and flawlessly. The second dated perspective is you have to learn a whole new paradigm. Okay, this is 1 out of 5. So you have to learn some paradigm when you want to do React Native and React Native Web. Here's an example. I'm not sure if it is visible at the rear, but this is an example of a checkbox. This has a checkbox component. Then we have checkbox indicator, icon, and a bunch of other props there. And this is a very interactive documentation. It was a part of a documentation. I don't think this looks like React Native at all. In fact, it looks more like the web counterpart. Does this look like Radix? It looks like Radix, but I'm sorry, this is universal code. This is from BlueStack UI. The second example, this is another CSS-in-JS library, which is cross-platform. You can see that we can use the style function very similar to style components and then pass in our object, and this works. And this is not just for web. This is for native and web. So when you say you have to learn a whole new paradigm, you do have to learn some bits, but not like everything. Great. Third one is you are limited by the capabilities of React Native. This is somewhat true, so I have rated this as 2 out of 5. But you can always write platform-specific code. Though the styling is a subset, there are new libraries coming in every day that are making it possible to go out of the boundary of just React Native and make sure you write a lot of code that is shareable. And if you can't, you can write platform-specific code, we have a very nice documentation on that. Accessibility is another thing that is often talked about when we talk about React Native. It's very nicely implemented. We have the entire accessibility props that you can implement across your form elements, buttons, hover state, and all those different states. In fact, we also contributed to it. We worked with Adobe on their React ARIA project and built React Native ARIA, which is the React ARIA counterpart, and that is universal. You can use these hooks in your React Native apps, and then it just works. Be it a checkbox, be it a, say, drop-down, be it a menu item, list icon, and all those things, right, from modules to everything is supported, and we have hooks for all of them. We have the developers of these here in this hall. Nishan also contributed, the first speaker today, to this project a lot. And we also worked with few of the contributors from my team worked with on this PR of React Native that says to implement the ARIA properties, which is a drop-in replacement of the same props on web and mobile. So something like ARIA-label is now an alias of accessibility label, and we were able to implement the same props across web and mobile. So yeah, these were the folks who contributed to that. Great. So let's have a look at what are the differences when it comes to CSS, right? Because we have to build a CSS-in-JS library. So this is the entire set of features that is supported by React Native. By CSS. And we have things like styling, animation, measurement units, layouts, variables, tokens, selectors, pseudo classes, inheritance, media queries, global styles, and it goes on and on. While React Native is only a part of it. React Native only supports the first 4 of it, that is styling, animation, measurement units, and layouts. The rest of those are not available directly in React Native. So what do? We have to build a CSS-in-JS library that supports all these. So somehow you have to write code that works in your library and maps to React Native and web as well. Great. So this is the dreamland that this talk is all about. So going from this to the entire set of CSS, and then implementing a universal CSS-in-JS library that works everywhere. The dreamland. The question is, why are we doing CSS-in-JS? Like, can we just do CSS everywhere? Why do we need JavaScript? CSS is powerful enough. Can we write something that gets transpiled to React Native, and we write just CSS? But looks like we can, but there are challenges. So my friend said day before yesterday, he asked this question on Twitter. Like, he has seen the new flavor of CSS-in-JS slowly getting more popular, where you compile out the entire JS to .css files. And he wanted to know the reasons, because CSS is powerful enough. We have tokens, we have the calc function, we have a lot of different things. One reason that he could think of was type safety, because you don't have type safety in CSS. I was quick enough to reply to his tweet that React Native compatibility, because React Native only understands JavaScript. So we have to do JS first API and then map it to different platforms. And also the entire DX is improved when you stay in the same language and don't fight between 2 different languages altogether. So this is how it works. You have a unified API on the top, and on web, like CSS and JS, the browser can understand, but while React Native can only understand the JavaScript part. Great. But I've seen some tweets from Evan. He says that there's first-class styling coming to Expo 49, which I'm not sure if it is available across like web and mobile, or is it just for web? Because they have this coming for the Metro bundler. Great. But that will eventually compile to JS, because React Native only understands JS. So let's build our universal CSS-in-JS library. We have talked a lot now. We have some checklists that we want this library to have, the features. So it has to work on native and web, and then it has to support all the features of CSS. And then we have other reasons that people often talk about in CSS-in-JS, that it should not have, it introduces runtime overhead, and that makes our web apps slow, so it should not do it. It introduces new paradigm, and then people and developers already know CSS, right? So why should they use CSS-in-JS? So let's add this checklist again and have this like the ideal CSS-in-JS should have 0 runtime overhead. It should not introduce new paradigm, apart from all those 2 things that we have. Great. Moving on, let's talk about APIs. Like, we have CSS-in-JS, and there are multiple different APIs that we can use. The first one, obviously, React Native and React Native Web APIs. So it's one single entry point, and you deploy to web and mobile. What React Native essentially does, it renders a UI view on iOS, and it renders a view group on Android. And on web, with React Native Web, it renders a div. So you're getting best of all the worlds, while staying with a unified API. So, and the API looks like you have to create a stylesheet.create object, that is the style object, very similar to how you define a CSS class name, and then pass it into your view style, container.key essentially. And that runs on all the platforms. The problem here is that it's not co-located. Essentially, you can define the first line in a different file and then use the second one anywhere else. So it may bring in confusion. If you talk about composability of React, this is a bit against that philosophy. So it's not co-located. The styling you have to apply every single time to different components and different views. And then it doesn't still support all those features that we talked about earlier. Let's look at style components. We have this API, which was made famous by style components. We have style.h1 and then pass in a CSS declaration block, and then it returns a modified h1 component that has this style in itself. So you can define multiple of those and then start using those as React components in your tree. Great. So the downside here is, again, the runtime overhead. If you have to have some dynamic styling based on props, say if your button has $primary, and based on that you want to change some styling on the right side, you would write some callback functions based on props and then update your entire CSS string. This is not good for runtime, and style components has been known for this for a long time. About like it comes with a runtime overhead. Okay, that's the downside. Then comes Stitches. That solves it. Stitches is a very nice CSS-in-JS library with, and they say that's a zero runtime, near zero runtime. How they do it? They have flipped the entire object, and then it can be shipped as a CSS file altogether with a plugin. So this is the API. The object that you pass is the second argument. This is very similar to style components, but to define new props, you can use the variants object, and then you can pass in color violet and color gray. These are the two options that the color prop gets. And then at the bottom, you can see we have button color is equal to violet, or maybe you can say gray. So the difference here is that in the style components example, we had runtime overhead of JavaScript. But here, it's a plain old JavaScript object. This can be converted to a CSS declaration block or a CSS file during build time. So you have like near zero runtime overhead. Stitches is beautiful. If we tweak Stitches API and then we can somehow merge it with React Native and React Native Web, we can get to an API that is very close to our dreamland. Okay? So styled pressable and then pass in our CSS object. That pressable is coming from React Native, and then you get a style button. The fourth inspiration is style system. This was made famous by Chakra UI and also has its roots in Tailwind CSS. It like utility first CSS. Right? You can pass in say p-1 as the class name. It gets the one token. Similarly, Chakra has p is equal to double quotes 1. Right? So it gets the one token of the padding. So yeah, this is a nice API. So essentially what you can do is you can create a box component, and then you can use font size, font weight, p, mb, all those props straight away in your components, which is really nice. I mean, it comes handy. It may spoil your design system a bit. It is a very controversial topic in itself, but yeah, this is a nice API to have. It gives you a lot of freedom when you are building your product. So adding all those to our checklist, we reach to the final checklist that we need to have all these things. The universal, it needs to have all the features of CSS, ideal CSS-in-JS library like near zero runtime or no runtime overhead, plus the inspirations from style components, that atomic, composable, Stitches, like it should have variants, and utility props from a style system. Okay, let's build one. Great, so it's time for code. We'll start with the React Native API, stylesheet.create, create your red box, and then have some background color, pass in some CSS width, height, and then you get red box component. You can define a component and then pass styles.redbox. You get what you see on the right side. This is a plain old React Native code, but we want the style functions. So we can do, so this is our dream function, like styled, taken a React Native universal component and then pass in our CSS, and we should be able to use the red box like that. Cool? In just 4 lines of code, we can implement the most basic CSS-in-JS library. You can go ahead and create the style sheet object right in the function and pass in as the default style object all the time, and it just works in just 4 lines of code. But this is just the starting point. It gets way more complicated. So for example, composition. We want to build new components from the existing components. So say this is the base component, and you want to create a new component. like this with some modifications, right? So you can do that. So red box, and then we create a large red box. We pass in red box as the first parameter, and then update the width and height. And it looks like this. Yeah? How do we do it? We update our style function. We take in old styles. We compute the inherited styles, and then pass all of them in sequence in React Native. So React Native has a nice API. You can pass in a series of style objects, and it automatically merges those. So it works like composition. Great. So we have achieved the API of composition. The next one is theme tokens. We talk about theme tokens, and we don't talk about Ranveer Singh. How's that possible? So we have this guy who themes himself in zebra, chocolate wrapper, alien, and also wears a ghagra sometimes. Great. How can we do that? So we can define tokens in our CSS object. We call, like, say, we can use $primary, and we don't define that primary in our object. And that goes in a separate tokens key value pair, or maybe the theme object, we call it sometimes. We can define, okay, it's a blue color. How do we implement this? Pretty straightforward when it's JavaScript. You can write an interpolate function. You can replace the content of that token with the actual value by the token key value pair. And then the second part, you would essentially add it to your styled function. Somewhere down, you would translate all those tokens to the actual values, right? But on web, you may not do that because we want to use maybe CSS variables. We don't want any runtime overhead. In React Native, you don't have any option. But on web, you might need to create the entire string way before the browser loads. And we somehow do it like this. Maybe in a Babel plugin or in Webpack plugin, we can have this code and then write and build our entire CSS object string, and then we can inject that. So the last one that you see is CSS variables, and then we pass in the key value pair, attach it in the entire CSS style block. So this is different. That is what we need to do on web, because we want to use the power of CSS. We don't want to have that overhead coming to the JavaScript thread. Great. And then comes the responsive design, something that changes its behavior based on the circumstances. This guy. So same guy, depending on the atmosphere, he changes his behavior, right? So we have the API that looks like, say, media screen, and then we can have, say, min width 480 and change the color of that box to blue. This can go as a conditional. We can measure the window dimension. This is a React Native API. You can measure the window dimension. And based on the width, you can change the background color. This is a hard-coded value just for the sake of explanation, but you can essentially read that from the props and do all those things. For web, it's very different. We won't be doing that on the runtime. We won't be computing the width. We'll be relying back again on the CSS way of doing things, so that browser can measure things and update those things. So you would need to inject CSS media queries, and you would have SSR first media query so that you don't get flickering. Because if you do this in JavaScript, your browser would load the first time, and then later it would flicker and compute things and reapply the styles. So it is kind of essential for you to use CSS here and not do those things in the JavaScript thread. Otherwise, you end up in flickering and performance issues again. OK? Great. And it goes on and on. I mean, this is just the surface. Adding new features can be really tedious. It can be difficult. And say if you have to implement all those features that was there in the checklist, we'll have a lot of issues. So we built a plugin system that can give you new styled functions. So we call it create a styled, and then pass in a list of plugins very similar to Webpack and Babel. So these plugins intercept the behavior or the input and output of the style function, so that you can implement things like animation or maybe a font resolver, which is very different on React Native and web. And we have done all those heavy lifting, built a lot of plugins too. Reduced runtime overhead, like if you want to reduce, we would essentially build some Webpack plugins or Babel plugins, or because of the new set of bundlers like SWC and whatnot, you'll have to create that into multiple different ecosystems. If you have looked at vanilla extract CSS, They have built like plugins for all of them. And we are probably going to do that too. So yeah, after doing all those things, we reach to a point where we implement everything. So yeah, this is the project that has all those things. We would love to get contribution from everyone, the community members. Go ahead and have a look at this and use it in your project. And this is just one of the things that we are building. We have GlueStack UI and GlueStack Style. GlueStack Style is the CSS-in-JS library, while GlueStack UI is the headless component library. So go ahead and check it out. Would love to get contribution and PRs from everyone. I want to conclude my talk with this. So this is a 12-year or 13-year-old post by Brandon. He says, always bet on JavaScript. First, they said JavaScript could not be useful for building rich internet application. Then they said it couldn't be fast. Then they said it couldn't be fixed. It couldn't do multi-core or GPU. Wrong every single time. Always bet on JavaScript. Yes? Surprisingly, this also holds true for React Native. So always bet on React Native. Great. Thank you so much. So yeah, learn from each other, build great things, and we can connect on Twitter. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, Sanket,